The December sun hung low in the Colorado sky, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk, where Jackson Morgan reviewed the final contract. Outside his Denver office window, the city hummed with the sounds of progress, horse-drawn carriages, construction, and the distant whistle of locomotives. Inside, warmth radiated from a pot-bellied stove in the corner, the air heavy with the scent of leather furniture and Cuban cigars. $250,000. Jackson tapped the paper with a gold fountain pen. Steepest price I ever paid for land, Carlton. His lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and thinning hair, nodded sagely. The Arrow Creek property completes your holdings across the eastern section. Railroad access on one side, river on the other. No rancher in 3 states will match your operation. Jackson leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. At 36, he commanded an empire worth over $2 million, 3 sprawling ranches, cattle contracts with the Army, and investments in Denver's booming businesses. He'd built it all in just 12 years, starting with his father's modest homestead and transforming it through shrewd acquisitions and relentless work. The office showcased his success. A large map of Wyoming territory dominated one wall, color-coded sections marking Morgan properties in red. Framed newspaper articles chronicled his rise. The furniture, imported from New York, spoke of wealth without being ostentatious. Everything practical, everything earned. "Have the papers ready for my signature tomorrow," Jackson said, rising from his chair. "I need to check on the new thoroughbreds at the hotel stables." Carlton gathered his documents. "I heard Blackwater Ranch had excellent snowfall early this season. Your parents must be pleased with the prospects for spring grazing." A flicker of discomfort crossed Jackson's face. "I received a letter from Mother last month. All seems well. You haven't visited since summer, have you?" "Been occupied with the railroad negotiations," Jackson said, his tone closing the subject. 3 months passes quickly in business. In truth, it had been nearly 4 months since he'd made the journey to his parents' homestead. He sent money regularly, ensuring they wanted for nothing, but his presence was another matter. Each visit brought his father's quiet disappointment, his mother's careful avoidance of certain subjects. Easier to focus on building his empire than to face the silence between them. The knock at his office door came as a welcome interruption. "Come," Jackson called. A young man in Western Union uniform entered, cap in hand. "Telegram for Mr. Morgan, sir, marked urgent." Jackson took the yellow envelope, tipped the messenger, and waited until the door closed before tearing it open. 3 lines of text, stark and unadorned. "Parents' home destroyed by fire, stop, both alive. Staying with neighbor, stop, come immediately, stop." His blood went cold as he read the words again. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. "Bad news?" Carlton asked, concern evident in his voice. Jackson was already moving, pulling his coat from the rack. "My parents' house burned down. I need to leave immediately." Of course. What about the Arrow Creek papers?" Jackson paused at the door. "Life and death come before business, Carlton. Handle it until my return." Within the hour, Jackson had collected his belongings from the Windsor Hotel, sent telegrams postponing his appointments, and retrieved his personal mount from the stables. The thoroughbred stallion, a 17-hand black Morgan horse named Emperor, was worth more than most men earned in 5 years. The animal seemed to sense his master's urgency, dancing sideways as Jackson secured his saddlebags. "Easy, boy," he murmured, checking the rifle scabbard and ammunition pouches. Denver in December wasn't Wyoming, but the journey north would turn harsh quickly. Snow had already begun falling as he left the city, large flakes swirling in the wind. His heavy beaver fur coat and gloves kept the worst of the cold at bay, but a sense of foreboding settled over him that no physical warmth could dispel. Fire in winter meant tragedy upon tragedy, the destruction followed by exposure to killing cold. The telegram's terse message had said his parents were alive, but in what condition? William Morgan was 65, his heart weakened by old war wounds. Rebecca Morgan, though resilient at 60, had suffered pneumonia last winter, and fire destroyed everything. Photographs, heirlooms, the very shelter needed to survive Wyoming's brutal season. Jackson urged Emperor to a faster pace, knowing he'd need to reach the Burlington Northern Station before nightfall. From there, the train would carry them to Cheyenne, and then another hard ride to the eastern edge of the territory where his parents' homestead sat in the shadow of the Laramie Mountains. By the time Jackson stepped off the train in Cheyenne 2 days later, a full blizzard had descended. The livery owner shook his head when Jackson inquired about continuing north. "No man with sense rides into that, Mr. Morgan, even with that fine animal of yours." Jackson placed 3 gold eagles on the counter. "My parents need me." The man sighed, pocketing the coins. "Your funeral. Take the northern trail through Miller's Pass, more sheltered from the wind. Stop at Jensen's way station if the snow gets worse." Jackson nodded his thanks, but knew he wouldn't stop. Emperor was strong, the stallion's breeding made for endurance, and something in Jackson's chest drove him forward. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, perhaps the knowledge that he'd chosen ambition over family once too often. The journey north became a battle against nature itself. Wind screamed across the open plains, driving snow horizontally into man and beast. The temperature plummeted as darkness fell, transforming the moisture in Jackson's breath to ice crystals on his beard. He kept Emperor moving at a steady pace, knowing that to stop meant death. Hours blended together, marked only by the pain in his frost-nipped cheeks and the burning in his thighs. Finally, as the gray dawn broke, familiar landmarks emerged through the swirling white. The lone sentinel pine that marked the boundary of Blackwater Ranch. The rise of land that sheltered the Morgan homestead from northern winds. When Jackson crested the final hill, his heart sank. Where the sturdy 2-story cabins should have stood, only a blackened skeleton remained. Snow had already begun covering the ruins, nature's shroud over human tragedy. "No," he whispered, the words stolen by the howling wind. He dismounted, boots sinking deep into the snow as he stumbled toward the ruined structure. The stone chimney stood alone, surrounded by charred timbers and twisted metal from the stove and bed frames. The cold had preserved the acrid smell of burnt wood and fabric. "Father! Mother!" His voice cracked as he called out, though he knew they wouldn't be here. The telegram had said they were with neighbors, but which ones? The Jensens to the east? The Wilsons to the north? "Morgan!" Jackson spun toward the voice, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Through the swirling snow, he made out a figure approaching on horseback. Pearson? Jackson recognized their nearest neighbor, an old homesteader who'd settled in the valley the same year as his father. The old man dismounted with surprising agility, his weathered face grim beneath a snow-covered hat. "Your parents are alive." Relief flooded through Jackson, nearly buckling his knees. "Where?" "With the Reed woman." Pearson gestured toward the distant hills where a faint light glowed against the darkening sky. "Up on Ridge Creek." "Eleanor Reed?" The name sounded vaguely familiar. "Widow woman. Husband died couple years back. Strange thing is, she wasn't just passing by like she claims." Jackson frowned, cold exhaustion making it difficult to follow the old man's meaning. "What do you mean?" "According to your ma, she'd been keeping an eye on your folks ever since that city man came around making threats about selling their land." "What city man?" "Some fellow named Hargrove. Works for a bank in town. Been pressuring smaller homesteaders to sell. Your pa refused him." Jackson felt as if he'd been struck. Vincent Hargrove was his bank manager in Cheyenne, handling the Morgan financial affairs whenever Jackson was away. The man couldn't possibly have been threatening his parents. "Reed overheard the argument from the ridge while gathering herbs," Pearson continued. "Said she didn't like his tone, so she'd been checking on your parents every night since. She was approaching the house when she saw the flames. Got your folks out just before the roof collapsed." The implications crashed through Jackson's mind. His own bank manager threatening his parents. The fire following soon after. It couldn't be coincidence. "Thank you," he said, already turning back to Emperor. "I'll head to Ridge Creek now." Pearson caught his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "Morgan," his voice had hardened, "your folks needed you 3 days ago. They needed you 3 months ago. That woman's been sharing what little she has while you've been building your kingdom." Shame burned hotter than any fire could. Jackson nodded once, unable to meet the old man's eyes, and mounted his horse. As he turned toward the distant light on the ridge, snowflakes began to fall once more, erasing his tracks almost as soon as they were made. The small cabin on Ridge Creek glowed like a lantern against the storm, smoke curling from its chimney into the darkening sky. Jackson approached slowly, exhaustion making each step of his horse seem like 10. Through the frost-rimmed windows, he could see movement inside. The shadows of people gathered around a table. He dismounted, tethered Emperor beneath a crude lean-to beside the cabin, and moved to the window. Through crystalline patterns of frost, he saw his mother seated at a rough-hewn table, her silver braid loose over one shoulder. She was laughing, actually laughing, while a woman in a faded calico dress ladled stew into wooden bowls. His father sat at the head of the table, shoulders bent but spine still straight, with the military bearing he'd never lost. The familiar stern expression had softened as he watched the women, something almost like peace in his gaze. Jackson's throat tightened. How long since he'd seen his parents so at ease? How long since he'd heard his mother laugh? The weight of his neglect hit him with crushing force. He'd built an empire, owned 3 sprawling ranches, had a bank account that could buy half of Cedar Valley. But this stranger, this woman with flour on her apron and patches on her sleeves, was doing what he should have done. An empty rocking chair sat by the fire as if waiting. Jackson's hand hovered over the door, his breath frosting in the air. Inside, his mother's laughter rang out again, warm and bright. He couldn't bring himself to knock, to interrupt this moment of happiness as his presence might shatter. But the decision was taken from him as the door swung open. Cold air flooded the cabin. Eleanor Reed stood in the doorway, wooden spoon in hand, her gray eyes sharp as flint. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30 or 32, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her face might have been pretty, if not for the wariness that tightened her features. "Mr. Morgan," she said flatly. Behind her, his mother gasped, "Jackson." She rose from the table, joy and hurt warring on her face. His father didn't stand, didn't even turn around, just kept his eyes on his bowl. The silence stretched between them, decades of unspoken words filling the space. "You're late, Morgan," William finally said, his voice rough as gravel. "House burned down 3 days ago." In that moment, the old battlefield between father and son reopened. The surname instead of son, the coldness, the old resentment. This wasn't just about Jackson's absence these past months, but the older wound from when Jackson had donned Union blue against his father's wishes. He still remembered that spring day in 1862. The recruitment poster tacked to the general store wall, the way his father's face had hardened when Jackson announced his decision to enlist. "No son of mine fights for Lincoln's army," William had thundered, slamming his fist on the table so hard the plates jumped. William hadn't come to see him off at the station, hadn't read the letters Jackson sent from training camp. And when news came of Elizabeth's difficult pregnancy, William had written just once, not to his son, but to Elizabeth herself. "Come home to people who care for you properly," the letter had said. "Your husband has made his choice." For 2 years after Jackson's return, his father had refused to call him by name, only Morgan, as if speaking to a stranger. The wall between them had never fully come down, just weathered enough to let necessary words pass through. "Ma," Jackson said, stepping inside and pulling off his hat. Snow melted on the floorboards. "Po!" Eleanor closed the door behind him and set another bowl on the table without a word. Her movements were tight, controlled. She didn't look at him. "Sit," his mother said softly, gesturing to the empty chair. Rebecca Morgan had always been the bridge between her husband and son, spanning the chasm their stubborn pride had created. Jackson sat, the cabin's warmth making his frost-nipped cheeks burn. The small space was tidy despite its simplicity, one room really, with a loft overhead. A pot bubbled over the fire, and the smell of venison stew made his stomach clench with hunger he hadn't realized he felt. "I came as soon as I heard," he started. "We got them," his father interrupted, still not looking at him. "Paper don't fill a belly." Jackson flinched. Eleanor ladled stew into his bowl and set it down with more force than necessary. "Eat," she said. Not an invitation, a command. He picked up the spoon. The stew was good, better than anything his ranch cook made, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. "How long have they been here?" he asked, looking at Eleanor. "Since the fire," she said curtly. "Found them huddled in your barn, half frozen. Brought them here. And you've been taking care of them." "Feeding them," she corrected. "Keeping them warm, that's all." Jackson reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. Coins clinked inside. Let me pay you. It's the least I can do. Eleanor's eyes went cold. The least would have been showing up, Mr. Morgan. She turned her back on him. This isn't a transaction. You can't buy decency. Silence fell like a hammer. His mother reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand in solidarity. His father still hadn't looked at him. Jackson set the pouch down slowly. I'm sorry, he said. Eleanor didn't turn around. Sorry doesn't keep people warm. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled, and Jackson realized he was the outsider here, the stranger in his own parents' lives. The next morning, pale sunlight broke through the clouds. The snow had crusted overnight, hard enough to walk on. Jackson woke on the floor near the fire, his back stiff from the unaccustomed hardness. Eleanor was already up, stoking the embers and setting a kettle to boil. His parents still slept in the loft above. I need to check on my horse, Jackson said quietly, pulling on his coat. Eleanor nodded without looking at him. Outside, the world was blindingly white. Emperor had weathered the night well enough in the lean-to, though he still looked exhausted from the previous day's desperate ride. As Jackson filled a bucket with snow to melt for the animal, he noticed a small path leading away from the cabin, freshly broken through the snow. Curiosity pulled him along it. The path wound through a stand of pines and opened onto a small clearing. There, in the stillness of the winter morning, stood a small graveyard. Two headstones stood side by side, simple and weathered. Thomas Reed, 1847-1883. Catherine Reed, 1830-1881. Eleanor knelt before them, brushing snow from the graves with her bare hands. She hadn't heard his approach. Jackson stood 10 paces back, hat in hand, feeling like an intruder on private grief. My husband and mother, Eleanor said without turning, somehow sensing his presence. Fever took Thomas 2 winters ago, left me the cabin, the debts, and his good name. She paused. I lost everything, but I didn't bury myself with them. Her words hit Jackson like a fist to the chest. He thought of Elizabeth, his wife, the way she'd smiled when she told him she was with child, the way that smile had faded as labor went on too long, too hard, the midwife's grim face, the silence where a baby's cry should have been. He'd left the nursery intact for 6 months. Then he'd locked the door and thrown himself into work. Built ranches, bought land, hired men, anything to keep moving, keep building, keep avoiding the empty room with the empty cradle. He'd sent his parents money because it was easier than sitting with them, easier than facing their questions, easier than feeling anything at all. Eleanor stood and faced him. You think money fills the hole? It doesn't, Jackson admitted. I know that now. Do you? Her assessment cut through his expensive coat to the hollow beneath. The wind shifted. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Eleanor looked up at the sky. Another storm's coming. You're staying whether you like it or not. She walked past him toward the cabin. Might as well make yourself useful. Back inside, his mother had moved the empty rocking chair closer to the fire. She patted the worn seat. Sit, son. Stay a while. Jackson sat. His father glanced at him for the first time, didn't say anything, just nodded once and went back to whittling a piece of wood. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. 4 days snowed in taught Jackson what it meant to be useful. His hands, soft from signing contracts and shaking hands with bankers, split and blistered from chopping wood. Eleanor bandaged them without comment, her touch efficient and impersonal. He learned to milk the goat, badly at first, until his father showed him the right grip. He hauled water from the creek, breaking through ice with an axe. He mended a broken chair leg, following his father's quiet instructions, and he learned to knead bread. Eleanor stood beside him at the table, her hands working the dough with practiced ease. Push with your palms, not your fingers. Like this. He tried. The dough stuck to his hands. You're too gentle, she said. It needs strength. He pressed harder. The dough began to come together. Better, she said, almost a compliment. His mother hummed hymns by the fire. His father told old stories about the early days in Wyoming, before the railroads, before the towns, when it was just land and sky and survival. Jackson listened, really listened, and something in his chest began to thaw. On the 3rd day, as Jackson split wood behind the cabin, he cut his hand deeply with the axe. Blood blossomed across the snow as he stumbled back toward the door. Eleanor saw him coming and swept everything off the table in one fluid motion. Sit, she commanded, pulling a worn leather case from beneath her bed. Inside lay a collection of medical instruments, neatly arranged and well-maintained. With practiced hands, she cleaned the wound, stitched it closed, and bandaged it tightly. You have a doctor's touch, Jackson said, watching her work. She paused just for a moment. My mother taught me. Catherine Reed was one of the finest nurses in Virginia during the war. She served at the Richmond hospitals. From his chair by the fire, William looked up sharply, studying Eleanor with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. That night, when Eleanor had gone to check on the animals and his mother had climbed to the loft to sleep, Jackson found himself alone with his father for the first time in years. The silence between them had weight, substance. Mother seems happy here, Jackson finally said. William nodded, continuing to whittle what was taking shape as a small horse. Your mother finds joy wherever she lands, always has. He paused. It's why she forgave you so easily. Jackson stiffened. For what? For choosing a war over your pregnant wife. For building your fortune while we struggled. For sending money instead of coming home. The old anger rose in Jackson's chest. I fought because it was right. The Union needed. I don't give a damn what the Union needed. William cut him off. Elizabeth needed you. When she died bringing your son into the world, we needed you. Not your money, Morgan. You win. Jackson stood, unable to sit still under the weight of his father's judgment. You're one to talk about choosing sides. You and your Southern sympathies. I sympathized with neighbors, not causes. William's voice remained level. I nursed wounds. I didn't make them. Is that why you couldn't look at me when I came home in uniform? Jackson's voice rose. Because I made wounds? I couldn't look at you, William said slowly, because every time I did, I saw Elizabeth standing at the window, watching the road, waiting for you to come home. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air along with Eleanor. She looked between them, sensing the tension, but said nothing as she hung her shawl by the door. Jackson turned away, staring into the fire as if it held answers. The next morning, as Eleanor tended to his hand, rewrapping the bandage, she spoke without looking up. Your father loves you, you know. Jackson snorted. He has a strange way of showing it. Most men do. Her fingers were gentle despite her brusque manner. War changes how men express love. Makes them believe strength means silence. You know a lot about war for a frontier widow. Something flickered across her face. My mother knew enough for both of us. She served as a nurse at Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, Confederate side. Jackson looked at her with new interest. And your father? Died at Chancellorsville, Confederate officer. She secured the bandage. My mother married a Union veteran after the war. They tried to bridge what the war had broken. And did they succeed? Eleanor's eyes held a distant sorrow. For a time, until fever took them both. But they taught me that healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds. She stood. The supplies are dwindling. The flour sacks nearly empty. Salt's almost gone. Jackson welcomed the change of subject. I'll ride to town tomorrow. Buy what we need. Eleanor's jaw tightened. We're fine. You're not fine. You're running out. We'll manage, Mr. Morgan. Why won't you let me help? Frustration edged his voice. Is your pride worth going hungry? Eleanor's eyes flashed. My pride is all I have left, Mr. Morgan. When Thomas died, this town watched me struggle through that first winter. The bank tried to take this land. The pastor suggested I sell and move east to family I don't have. No one helped. She took a step closer to him. I survived because I refused to break. I won't become a charity case now just because you feel guilty. It's not charity. Hey, Jackson insisted. It's payment for looking after my parents. Payment. Eleanor's voice was flat. That's all it ever is with you, isn't it? Money to solve problems. Money instead of presents. She turned away. Keep your coins, Mr. Morgan. I don't want them. That night, unable to sleep, Jackson found Eleanor sitting alone by the dying fire. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft snores from the loft and the occasional pop from the burning logs. Why did you save them? He asked quietly, sitting across from her. My parents. You could have left them in the barn. Eleanor stared into the embers. Because it was right. even knowing who they were, who I am. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. I didn't know who they were, only that they needed help. She paused. Though your mother told me later about you, your success, how proud she was despite everything. Jackson felt a pang of guilt. And my father, what did he say about me? Nothing at first. Then one night he said, you did what you thought was right, even when it cost you everything. He said it was both your greatest strength and your deepest flaw. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer than he'd heard before. I saw you found my family's graves. Jackson nodded. I'm sorry for your losses. Are you? She looked at him directly. Or are you sorry for your own? The question caught him off guard. Both, I suppose. Tell me about her. You're Elizabeth. No one had asked him that in years. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. He told Eleanor about Elizabeth's laugh, her love of books, the way she could calm the wildest horse with just a few whispered words. How she'd been so happy about the baby even as he'd been terrified. How he'd promised to be home for the birth, but had been delayed by a battle that, in the grand scheme of the war, had meant nothing. I thought I was fighting for a better world for them, he said, voice hollow. Instead, I lost my world entirely. And so you built a new one of timber and cattle and banknotes. I couldn't stop moving, he admitted. Stillness terrified me. If I stopped, I'd have to feel it. The loss, the failure. Stillness isn't weakness, Eleanor said softly. It's where healing starts. She placed her hand over his bandaged palm. He didn't pull away. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing. 2 days later, 4 horses appeared outside the cabin. Eleanor opened the door to find Pastor Morrison and 3 town councilmen on her porch, hats in hand, faces grim. Her stomach turned to ice. Mrs. Reed, the pastor said, we need to speak with Mr. Morgan. Jackson appeared behind her. I'm here. The pastor cleared his throat. Mr. Morgan, this arrangement is unseemly. You're a man of standing. She's a widow. You're living under one roof without proper— Get out, Eleanor interrupted. The pastor blinked. Excuse me? I said get out of my home. Mrs. Reed, we're only concerned for your reputation. My reputation? Her voice shook with barely controlled anger. Where were you when I was starving last winter? Where were you when Thomas died and the bank tried to take this land? She stepped forward, forcing the men to back up. I don't need your concern. I don't need your judgment. And I sure as hell don't need you telling me who can stay in my home. One of the councilmen spoke up. Mr. Morgan, you must either leave or make your intentions honorable. Surely you see, Eleanor turned to Jackson, waiting for him to speak. He opened his mouth, closed it. Fear flickered in his eyes. Fear of commitment, fear of loss, fear of risking his heart again. He said nothing. The silence stretched like a chasm. Before Jackson could find his voice, William appeared in the doorway behind them, his tall frame filling the space. I have something to say, he announced to the councilman. Mr. Morgan, Pastor Morrison began, with all due respect, this woman, William continued as if the pastor hadn't spoken, is no stranger to our family. He turned to Eleanor. I recognize the name Reed now. Your mother was Catherine Reed, wasn't she? The nurse at Richmond who trained under my sister Margaret. Eleanor stared at William astonished. Your sister? Margaret Morgan Caldwell was your sister? William nodded. We were estranged during the war. She married a plantation owner, sided with the Confederacy. I joined the Union. Brothers fought brothers in that war. Why not sister and brother too? He continued, his voice strong. Eleanor's mother saved my life at Gettysburg. Union soldier behind Confederate lines. She could have let me die. Instead, she treated the wound from cannon shrapnel and stayed when the Union forces advanced. Jackson looked from his father to Eleanor, confused. William continued, his voice strong. This woman has honored her mother's legacy by saving our lives twice over. She is a benefactor to the Morgan family. And if you gentlemen are concerned with honor, then start by repaying that debt of honor. The councilman shifted uncomfortably. There is nothing more to discuss, William said firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife is resting, and we have work to do. With reluctance, the men mounted their horses and rode away. But their visit had awakened old fears in Jackson. That night, as everyone slept, he quietly packed his saddlebags, left a pouch of money on the table with a note of apology, and slipped away into the darkness. Jackson Morgan's ranch was exactly as he'd left it, grand, empty, silent. The sprawling main house stood 3 stories tall, built of stone and timber in a style that mimicked the mansions of Denver's elite. Inside, expensive furnishings gathered dust. Unused rooms waited for guests who never came, and the echo of his boots on polished floors was his only company. He sat in his study for 3 days, staring at account ledgers, numbers that meant nothing, contracts that felt like chains. His ranch foreman came and went, reporting on cattle counts and fence repairs, speaking to a master who barely heard him. "Mr. Morgan?" Hank Peters, his foreman of 8 years, hesitated at the doorway. "The men are asking about the spring preparations, and there's a telegram from your lawyer in Denver about the Arrow Creek purchase." Jackson looked up from his untouched whiskey. The study's large windows overlooked rolling hills dotted with prime cattle. In the distance, white-capped mountains caught the late afternoon sun. All his, all empty. "Tell them to proceed as planned," he said automatically, "and wire Carlton that I'll review the papers next week." "Yes, sir." Peters lingered, concern evident on his weathered face. "Forgive my asking, but is everything all right? You've been distant since your return." Jackson considered the question. Was everything all right? He had wealth beyond measure. 3,000 head of cattle, horses worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, land stretching to the horizon. And yet he'd left a small cabin on Ridge Creek where people laughed around a simple wooden table, where his mother hummed while baking bread, where his father carved wooden figures by the fire, where Eleanor read, "I'm fine, Hank, just tired from the journey." "Of course, sir." Peters nodded, unconvinced. "Oh, and Mr. Hargrove from the bank stopped by earlier. Said he needed to speak with you about urgent business. I told him you weren't receiving visitors." Jackson's attention sharpened. "Hargrove was here?" "Yes, sir. Seemed put out that you wouldn't see him. Said something about railroad business that couldn't wait. If he returns, inform me immediately." A week passed, then another, the rhythm of daily work gradually healing more than just William's heart. After Peters left, Jackson unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small metal box. Inside lay the letters he'd recovered from his father's strongbox, correspondence between William Morgan and his sister Margaret spanning 20 years. The earliest letters dated from before the war, when Margaret Morgan had been unmarried and living with their parents in Virginia. Her elegant script spoke of local dances, potential suitors, and the increasing political tension that would eventually tear the nation apart. Then came the fateful letter announcing her engagement to James Caldwell, owner of a tobacco plantation near Richmond. William's response, preserved in a rough draft, was coldly formal. He warned his sister about tying herself to the slave-holding aristocracy, about the coming conflict that would destroy the South. Margaret's reply defended her choice, her new home, her husband's more moderate views on slavery. The letters grew increasingly hostile until they stopped altogether when war was declared. The next correspondence came after the peace at Appomattox, a brief note from Margaret informing William that she had survived, though her husband had died at Cold Harbor, and that she now ran a hospital for wounded soldiers in Richmond. Would he consider reconciliation? William's draft response was never sent, full of crossed-out accusations and grief. The final letters came in 1881 from a nurse who had worked with Margaret. Catherine Reed wrote to inform William that his sister had died when fire swept through Richmond during a spring storm. Her last words had been of family, of regrets, of the brother she had never reconciled with. Catherine's letter mentioned a daughter, Eleanor, who had trained as a nurse under Margaret's guidance. "She carries your sister's teachings in her hands," Catherine had written, "the healing knowledge that sees no uniform, only human suffering." Jackson set aside the letters and poured himself another whiskey, this time drinking it down in one burning swallow. The connections between the families seemed too coincidental, too fateful. His father's sister had mentored Eleanor's mother. Both women had chosen to heal wounds in a time when most were creating them. And now, decades later, Eleanor had saved his parents from a fire, just as her mother had once saved his father in war. On the fourth night, Jackson found himself standing outside the nursery door. He'd locked it 5 years ago and never opened it since. His hands shook as he turned the key. Inside, dust covered everything. The cradle sat in the corner, a folded quilt draped over the edge. A rocking horse, a shelf of books he'd never read aloud. The room preserved exactly as Elizabeth had arranged it, waiting for a child who never arrived. Jackson sank to his knees and wept. Not the silent, controlled tears of the funeral, but raw, racking sobs that shook his entire frame. Grief he'd sealed away for 5 years poured out in the silence of the empty nursery. When morning came, he had made his decision. He summoned Hank Peters and issued a series of instructions regarding the ranch's operation in his absence, then rode to town. Cheyenne had grown considerably since Jackson had first arrived as a young veteran, with nothing but determination and his father's old cavalry pistol. Now the territorial capital boasted stone buildings, proper streets, and the unmistakable signs of permanence. The Morgan Valley Bank occupied a prominent corner on the main avenue, its facade of imported stone speaking to its importance. The tellers and clerks straightened as Jackson entered, nodding deferentially to the majority shareholder. Without pausing, he strode directly to the manager's office at the rear of the building. Vincent Hargrove looked up from his desk, momentary surprise, quickly masked by a professional smile. At 45, Hargrove cut an impressive figure with his tailored suit, gold watch chain, and carefully groomed mustache. He stood, extending his hand. "Mr. Morgan, what a pleasant surprise. I was just about to ride out to see you again." Jackson ignored the outstretched hand. "We need to talk, Vincent." The smile faltered. "Of course, please, have a seat. Would you care for coffee? Brandy, perhaps?" "I prefer to stand." Jackson's voice was dangerously calm. "I want to discuss your recent visit to my parents' property." Hargrove's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered briefly. "I don't understand. I haven't visited your parents in some time." "That's interesting because multiple witnesses place you there the week before their house burned down. A case of mistaken identity, surely." Hargrove moved to pour himself a drink. "Many men in suits travel through that area. The railroad survey has brought all manner of officials. You threatened my father when he refused to sell his land." The glass paused halfway to Hargrove's lips. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Morgan." "It's a fact. What I don't understand is why. My father's property isn't on any railroad route I'm aware of. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Hargrove glanced meaningfully toward the door, away from the bank. "I think here is perfect." Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I want to know exactly what you've been doing with my name and authority while I've been building the ranch." A calculating look entered Hargrove's eyes. "Building the ranch? Is that what you think you've been doing, Jackson? While you've been playing cowboy in the wilderness, I've been securing our future, our legacy." "Our legacy?" "The Morgan Valley Bank isn't just a storehouse for cattle money anymore. We're financing the future of Wyoming territory. Railroad lines, commercial development, government contracts. Progress requires vision." Hargrove's tone grew passionate, almost fevered. "And sometimes vision requires clearing obstacles." "Obstacles like my parents?" Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. "Small holdings, small minds. All those homesteaders clinging to their pitiful acres while progress waits to transform the land into something greater." "Those are people's homes," Jackson said quietly. "Their lives." "They're in the Oh," Hargrove snapped. "Wyoming will be a state soon. Do you think small ranchers will determine its future?" "No, men like us will. Men of vision who understand that sentiment is the enemy of progress." Jackson stared at the man he'd trusted with his financial affairs for years, seeing him clearly for the first time. In Hargrove's calculating eyes, Jackson saw a reflection of what he himself had been becoming, a man who valued wealth over people, expansion over connection. "You're fired, Vincent," Jackson said quietly. Hargrove blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're fired. Pack your personal belongings and be out by noon." "You can't be serious. After everything I've done for you, you're dismissing me over some backwater sentiment?" Hargrove's voice rose. "I've doubled your wealth in 3 years." "At what cost?" Jackson met his gaze steadily. "You used my name to threaten my own family. What else have you done without my knowledge?" Hargrove's face flushed with anger. You fool! You provincial, sentimental fool! Do you think you built this empire with clean hands? Every acre you own came at someone else's expense. I just had the stomach to admit it. Draw up papers canceling all foreclosure proceedings initiated in the last year, Jackson instructed, his voice level despite the fury building inside him. Every single one. That's dozens of properties, thousands in lost revenue. Every one, Vincent, especially Eleanor Reed's. Recognition flickered in Hargrove's eyes. The widow on Ridge Creek? Her property sits on a natural pass that the railroad needs. Her foreclosure is already in motion. Cancel it, Jackson said, and prepare a clear title to her property. Free and clear. The bank will absorb any outstanding debt. You're throwing away money because of a woman? Hargrove sneered. Has the great Jackson Morgan finally found his weakness? I've found my conscience, Jackson corrected him, something you might want to look for yourself. As Hargrove gathered his things, cursing under his breath, Jackson turned to the window. In the distance, he could see the mountains where Eleanor's cabin perched, where his parents were, where for the first time in years he had felt something other than the cold drive to accumulate more. A messenger arrived that evening as Jackson was preparing to return to Ridge Creek, bringing news that chilled him to the bone. William Morgan had suffered a heart attack, a delayed consequence of his old war wound. Eleanor was using her nursing skills to keep him alive, but his condition was deteriorating. Without hesitation, Jackson loaded a wagon with supplies, medicine, food, building materials, everything the cabin might need. But before he left, he made one final stop. The cemetery lay quiet under a blanket of snow. Elizabeth's grave was simple, marked by a stone he'd commissioned but never visited. He knelt before it, brushing snow from the inscription. I've been running from you, he said aloud, from our baby, from everything we lost. I thought if I kept moving, kept building, I could outrun the pain. He paused. But I can't, and I'm done trying. I can't bring you back. But I can stop wasting the life you gave me. I can stop being afraid. From his pocket, he withdrew the small wooden horse his father had been carving. William had finished it the day before Jackson left, sliding it across the table with no words of explanation. Now Jackson understood. It wasn't just a toy. It was a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope. As the sun began to set, Jackson mounted Emperor and headed back toward Ridge Creek, the laden wagon following behind. This time he wasn't fleeing from something. He was riding toward something, toward family, toward healing, toward home. Jackson rode through the night, the wagon's runners cutting smooth paths through fresh snow. Emperor strained against the harness, sensing his rider's urgency. Stars glittered overhead in the cold, clear sky, offering just enough light to navigate the familiar trail to Ridge Creek. Each mile brought memories of childhood summers spent exploring these hills, of his father teaching him to track deer through these same forests, of Elizabeth riding beside him during their courtship, her laughter echoing among the pines. But these memories no longer crippled him with grief. They accompanied him like old friends, reminding him of who he'd been and who he might become again. Dawn broke as he crested the final ridge. The small cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Someone was awake despite the early hour. As he drew closer, the door opened and Eleanor stepped onto the porch, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched his approach, her face unreadable in the gray morning light. Jackson halted the wagon and dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance. He with his laden wagon, a peace offering of sorts. She with her proud stance, unbending despite everything. You left, Eleanor said finally, her breath clouding in the cold air. I did. Jackson stepped forward, leaving Emperor and the wagon behind. And I'll regret it the rest of my life. Then why come back? Because I'm done running. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, close enough now to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the worry lines etched around her mouth. How is he? Eleanor's composure wavered. Not good. The heart attack was severe. His old war wound never fully healed inside. She paused. I've done what I can, but he needs more than I can give him here. I brought medicine, Jackson said, and supplies. Lumber to expand the cabin, seeds for spring planting, tools for repairs. Why? The simple question held layers of meaning. Jackson met her gaze. Because I'm asking if you'll let me stay. Not as a guest, not as charity, but as a partner. Eleanor studied him, searching for truth or deceit in his face. You left once before. I know. His voice cracked. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again. He gestured to the wagon. Those aren't just supplies, Eleanor. They're a promise, Waika. She looked past him at the wagon, at the bounty he'd brought. Her expression softened slightly. Then she remembered herself. Your father's inside, she said quietly. He needs you. Jackson nodded and followed her into the cabin's warmth. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp. His mother sat by William's bedside, holding his hand, her face drawn with worry. She looked up when Jackson entered, relief flooding her features. Son, she whispered, you came back. I should never have left, Ma. Jackson crossed to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then he looked down at his father. William Morgan lay still beneath layers of quilts, his face pallid, breathing labored. He'd aged a decade in the short time since Jackson had seen him last. The strong, stubborn man who'd built a home in this wilderness with nothing but determination and his own two hands now looked fragile, diminished. Pa, Jackson said, sinking to his knees beside the bed. He took his father's other hand, roughened by decades of work, now limp in his grasp. I'm here. William's eyes flickered open, focusing slowly. Recognition dawned along with something else. Not the anger or disappointment Jackson expected, but something softer. Sullivan, he whispered, the old habit of using the surname still present even now. No, Pa, it's Jackson. He squeezed the worn hand. Your son. A ghost of a smile touched William's lips. About time you remembered that. Eleanor moved quietly around them, preparing a tincture at the small table. Rebecca made room for her son, moving to help Eleanor while giving Jackson this moment with his father. I brought medicine, Jackson said, and a doctor from Cheyenne will come when the trail clears. William's eyes drifted closed. No need to fuss. There's every need, Jackson replied firmly. You're not done yet, old man. You've got more stories to tell, more horses to carve. William's fingers tightened slightly around Jackson's hand. Stubborn, like your mother. Jackson smiled through the tightness in his throat. Wonder where I got it from. Eleanor approached with a cup of steaming liquid. He needs to drink this. It will help with the pain and strengthen his heart. Together they raised William enough to sip the bitter medicine. His face contorted at the taste, but Eleanor was firm. All of it, Mr. Morgan. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor, William grumbled, but he drank. Near enough for now, she replied, her tone softening. My mother taught me well. Catherine Reed was one of the finest nurses in Richmond. She learned from your sister Margaret, who ran the hospital where my mother worked. As William settled back, Eleanor motioned for Jackson to follow her to the main room. His mother took his place at the bedside, humming softly as she stroked her husband's forehead. The medicine will help, Eleanor said, keeping her voice low. But he needs real doctors, real care, the kind I can't provide here. I've sent for Dr. Wilkins from Cheyenne, Jackson replied, and I'm prepared to bring specialists from Denver if necessary. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. All your money still talking, Mr. Morgan? No, he said firmly. This is my father we're discussing. I'll use every resource I have, not out of guilt, but out of love. She studied him, then nodded. Fair enough. But he can't be moved yet. The journey could kill him faster than his heart. Then we'll make this place what he needs. Jackson gestured to the cabin. I brought lumber, supplies. We can expand, make a proper sick room, whatever's necessary. We, Eleanor echoed, that single word carrying weight. Yes, we, if you'll allow it. After a long moment, Eleanor nodded. For your father's sake. For his sake, Jackson agreed, though they both sensed there was more to it than that. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Jackson unpacked the wagon, stocking the small pantry with more food than it had likely ever held. He cleared space in the lean-to for Emperor and began splitting logs for an addition to the cabin. Eleanor focused on William's care, brewing medicines from her dwindling supply of herbs, monitoring his condition with the precision of a trained nurse. On the morning of the 4th day, as Jackson was measuring lumber for the addition, A question that had been bothering him finally surfaced. "How did you learn so much about medicine?" he asked as Eleanor joined him outside, taking a rare break from William's bedside. "My mother," she replied simply. "Catherine Reed was trained by your Aunt Margaret during the war. She passed that knowledge to me before she died." "Your mother was Confederate?" "She was Virginian," Eleanor corrected. "Born in Richmond to a doctor, father who believed women should understand medicine, even if society didn't allow them to practice it officially. When the war came, he joined the Confederate Medical Service, and she followed as his assistant." Her eyes took on a distant look. After Antietam, there weren't enough trained nurses. She learned by necessity, stitching wounds, amputating limbs, comforting the dying. "And that's where she met your father?" Eleanor nodded. "Thomas Reed was a Union soldier captured at Fredericksburg, wounded in the leg. My mother treated him in the prison hospital. After the war, they found each other again, and they came west. There was nothing left for them in Virginia. Their home had been destroyed. His family had disowned him for marrying a rebel nurse. They worked their way west, eventually settling here." Her expression softened at the memory. "We had 2 good years as a family before fever took my mother. Then Thomas and I had another 3 years before the mining accident." Jackson let the silence stretch between them, absorbing this new understanding of Eleanor's complex past. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me, for saving my father." "Saving him is the easy part," Eleanor replied. "The hard part is what comes next, which is healing. Not just his body, but what lies between you." For Jackson could respond, the distant sound of hooves drew their attention. A single rider approached through the trees, the black frock coat marking him as Dr. Wilkins from Cheyenne. "Your doctor has arrived," Eleanor said, moving toward the cabin. "Let's hope he lives up to your expensive expectations." Dr. Wilkins confirmed what Eleanor had already determined. William had suffered a serious heart attack, likely triggered by smoke inhalation from the fire and complicated by his old war wound. He left additional medicines and instructions, but his prognosis was guarded at best. "Keep him calm, warm, and well-fed," the doctor instructed as he prepared to leave. "No exertion, no excitement, and send for me at the first sign of another attack." After the doctor departed, Eleanor organized the new medicines while Jackson resumed work on the addition. The sound of his hammer punctuated the quiet afternoon as he framed the extension that would nearly double the cabin size. Rebecca came outside, bundled against the cold, and watched him work. "It's good to see you building something with your hands again," she said, pride evident in her voice. "You were always good at it, even as a boy." Jackson smiled, driving another nail. "Pa taught me well, though I've forgotten more than I care to admit." "You haven't forgotten," Rebecca said gently. "You just set it aside for a while." She approached, touching the rough-hewn frame. "Eleanor says this will be a sick room for your father. For now, later it can be whatever she needs. A proper bedroom, a sitting room." He hesitated. "If she'll let me do this for her." Rebecca studied her son. "She's a proud woman. Reminds me of your father." "Not stubborn, you mean?" "Independent," Rebecca corrected. "Self-reliant. It's how they both survived." She paused. "Did you know she refused help from everyone after Thomas died? Even when she was clearly struggling." Jackson nodded, thinking of the thin-patched clothes, the nearly empty pantry. "She told me the town wasn't exactly forthcoming with assistance." "That's true, but it's not the whole truth," Rebecca lowered her voice. "Pastor Morrison arranged for the church to help her. Food, firewood, even money. She refused all of it. Said she didn't want charity disguised as Christian kindness." Jackson frowned. "What's the difference between charity and kindness?" "Intent," Rebecca said simply. "Charity makes the giver feel good about themselves. Kindness comes from recognizing yourself in another's struggle." She smiled sadly. "Your father understood that difference. It's why he never accepted your money, but treasured the letters you wrote, few as they were." The words struck home. Jackson set down his hammer, truly looking at his mother for the first time in years. The silver in her hair, the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of time he'd missed, struggles he'd been absent for. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said quietly, "for staying away, for thinking money could substitute for presence." Rebecca touched his cheek, a gesture so familiar it almost broke him. "You're here now, that's what matters. Is it enough, though, he asked, after everything? That depends, she replied, on whether you're here to stay or just passing through again. Before he could answer, Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her expression urgent. He's asking for you, Jackson. Both of you. William was awake, propped up slightly against the pillows. His breathing seemed easier than before, but his complexion remained bloodless. He gestured weakly for them to come closer. Need to talk, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. While I still can. Don't be dramatic, William, Rebecca chided gently, sitting beside him. Dr. Wilkins said you'll recover if you rest. If, William emphasized. He looked at Jackson. Things to say first, important things. Jackson pulled a chair close to the bed's other side. I'm listening, Pa. William drew a labored breath. The fire wasn't an accident. A cold feeling settled in Jackson's stomach. What do you mean? Man came 2 days before asking about selling the homestead. William's eyes closed briefly with the effort of speaking. Said the railroad needed the land, offered money. Not enough. Jackson exchanged a look with his mother. Did you recognize him? City man, fancy clothes, called himself a representative of progress. William's mouth twisted. Threatened that we'd regret refusing. Thought he was talking to an old fool who didn't understand business. The pieces fell into place in Jackson's mind. Hargrove, he said grimly. Vincent Hargrove. William nodded weakly. Found his card after. In your office. Your banker. Shame and rage warred within Jackson. His own employee using his name, threatening his parents, and then making good on that threat. I fired him, Jackson said 3 days ago, and canceled all his schemes, including the railroad deal. Good, William said, satisfaction briefly lighting his tired eyes. Never trusted him. Reminded me of the carpetbaggers after the war. Eleanor, who had been quietly mixing more medicine by the fire, approached the bed. You need to rest now, Mr. Morgan. This much talking isn't good for your heart. William shook his head stubbornly. One more thing. He looked at Jackson. The strong box. Did it survive the fire? Jackson nodded. I found it. The papers, the letters, the family Bible. Everything's safe. Relief washed over William's face. Good. Needed you to know about Margaret, about the past. His voice grew fainter. Some wounds. Never heal right if they're ignored. I understand, Pa. Jackson placed his hand over his father's. Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. As William drifted into sleep, Eleanor administered another dose of medicine. Soon his breathing steadied, deeper and less labored than before. Later that evening, as Jackson kept vigil by his father's bedside, he noticed something clutched in William's hand, a worn, folded paper. Carefully, he eased it from his father's fingers. It was a letter Jackson had written from the training camp, the creases deep from being folded and unfolded countless times. Understanding dawned slowly. His father's anger had always masked something deeper, not disappointment, but fear. Fear of losing his son as he had lost so many others to that terrible war. The realization softened something in Jackson's chest that had been hardened for years. When William's eyes fluttered open in the dim light, he looked at his son with clarity that had been absent before. You look tired, William said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm fine, Pa, Jackson replied, slipping the letter back into his father's hand. William's fingers closed around it. You kept them all, Jackson said, not a question. A slight nod. Everyone. Outside the sick room, Jackson paced the small main area of the cabin. Hargrove, he muttered. I should have seen it. The foreclosures, the pressure on small landowners. It was all part of his plan to secure the right-of-way for the railroad. And your parents' land was part of that plan, Eleanor concluded, washing her hands in a basin. When they refused to sell, he decided to remove the obstacle. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. He tried to burn them out, maybe even... He couldn't finish the thought, the possibility too horrific to voice. They survived, Eleanor reminded him gently. Focus on that. Jackson nodded, forcing himself to calm down. Tomorrow I'll ride it to the homestead, look for anything else we might salvage, then to town to make sure Hargrove is gone for good. And if he isn't, then I'll deal with him, Jackson's voice was hard. Legally, through the sheriff, I won't sink to his level. Eleanor seemed satisfied with this answer. Good. Your father needs healing, not vengeance. What about justice? Jackson challenged. Doesn't he deserve that too? Justice and vengeance often wear the same coat, Eleanor replied. Be careful which one you're reaching for. The next day, Jackson returned to the burned homestead. In the clear light of day, the destruction seemed even more complete than when he had first arrived. The cabin where he'd grown up was nothing but charred timbers and ash, a lifetime of memories reduced to cinders. As he searched through the ruins, salvaging what few items had survived, Jackson found himself remembering moments from his childhood. His father teaching him to ride in the meadow behind the house, his mother reading by the fire on winter evenings. The smell of bread baking. The sound of his father's laughter, rare but precious. When had he stopped valuing those things? When had acres and cattle and bank accounts become more important than the people who had given him life, who had taught him what it meant to be a man? In the remains of his father's workshop, Jackson found a half-finished carving buried under fallen roof beams. A bird in flight, its wings spread wide, the details exquisite despite being blackened by smoke. He carefully wrapped it in his handkerchief and placed it in his saddlebag. As he prepared to leave, Jackson noticed something glinting in the ash near where his parents' bedroom had stood. Kneeling, he brushed away debris to find his mother's silver hand mirror, the glass cracked but the frame intact. Another small treasure to return to its owner. In town, Jackson found Sheriff Taylor in his office, boots propped on his desk, reading a month-old newspaper from Denver. Morgan, the lawman acknowledged, setting aside his paper. Heard about your folks' place. Damn shame. It wasn't an accident, Tom. Jackson took a seat across from the sheriff. I believe Vincent Hargrove arranged it. The sheriff's expression sharpened. That's a serious accusation. Hargrove's got standing in this town. He's been pressuring homesteaders to sell, using the bank to foreclose on properties along the proposed railroad route. When my parents refused, their house mysteriously caught fire. Sheriff Taylor stroked his mustache thoughtfully. You got any proof? Not yet, but I intend to find it. Hargrove left town 3 days ago, the sheriff informed him. Said he was heading to Cheyenne on bank business. I fired him from the bank. If he's gone to Cheyenne, it's not on legitimate business. I'll send wires, have the authorities keep an eye out. Taylor leaned forward. But Jackson, tread careful. Men like Hargrove have friends in high places. Railroad money talks, and it talks loud. So does the truth, Jackson replied. His next stop was the Morgan Valley Bank. As majority owner, he needed to ensure Hargrove hadn't left any other unpleasant surprises behind. The bank manager, a nervous man named Simmons, who had worked under Hargrove, practically wilted when Jackson walked through the door. Mr. Morgan, we weren't expecting you. Mr. Hargrove said you were away on business. Mr. Hargrove no longer represents me or this bank, Jackson interrupted. I need to see all foreclosure notices issued in the past year. Every one of them. But sir, that's dozens of properties. It will take time to... Then you'd better start now. 3 hours later, the full extent of Hargrove's scheme became clear. He had systematically targeted small landholders along the proposed railroad route, manufacturing reasons for foreclosure or offering below-market purchases. Those who refused, like William and Rebecca, faced increasing pressure, and in at least one case, unexplained accidents. Jackson authorized immediate cancellation of all foreclosure proceedings and sent notices to every affected property owner. For those who had already lost their land, he authorized repurchase at the original sale price with additional compensation for hardship. But sir, Simmons protested weakly, this will cost the bank thousands. The shareholders... I am the primary shareholder, Jackson reminded him, and I'd rather lose money than lose my soul. He signed the final document with a flourish. See that these are processed immediately, Simmons. Your continued employment depends on it. As dusk approached, Jackson made one final stop before returning to Ridge Creek. The general store owned by the widow Chen was small but well-stocked, known for fair prices and the owner's uncanny ability to procure almost anything given time. Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with shrewd eyes who had come to Wyoming by way of San Francisco 20 years earlier, greeted Jackson with obvious surprise. Mr. Morgan, you honor my humble shop. What can I provide for you today? I need supplies for Ridge Creek, Jackson said, for Eleanor Reed's cabin. Mrs. Chen's expression changed subtly. Ah, Mrs. Reed, a good woman, very proud. Yes, she is. Jackson smiled slightly. That's why I'd appreciate your discretion in this matter. Understanding dawned in Mrs. Chen's eyes. Of course, these supplies are from you, but not from you. I understand perfectly. She tapped her temple. Business requires diplomacy. Jackson provided a list of items: medicines, fabric, tools, seeds for spring planting, and special comforts for an invalid. Mrs. Chen nodded as she reviewed it. Most I have in stock. The rest I can order from Denver. Will arrive in 2 weeks, weather permitting. Perfect. And I'd like weekly deliveries of fresh supplies. Meat, vegetables, whatever's available. Jackson placed a substantial deposit on the counter. Beginning tomorrow, if possible. Mrs. Chen counted the money carefully, then looked up at Jackson with new respect. Tomorrow, yes. My son will deliver at midday. She hesitated, then added, Mrs. Reed does not accept charity easily. How shall we explain? Jackson considered this. Tell her it's payment for caring for my parents, that the town has finally recognized its debt to her. Ah, Mrs. Chen smiled faintly. A matter of honor, not charity. Yes, this she might accept. As Jackson turned to leave, Mrs. Chen spoke again. One moment. She disappeared into the back of the shop, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. For Mrs. Reed, no charge. Jackson accepted it, curious. What is it? Tea, special blend, good for heart patients. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. When my husband was ill, she came. Every day for a week, would not accept payment. She patted the package. Some debts must be repaid, even years later. It seemed Eleanor had more allies in town than she realized, or would admit. Darkness had fallen by the time Jackson returned to the cabin. Light spilled from the windows, creating golden rectangles in the snow. He dismounted stiffly, his body aching from the day's exertions. The salvaged mirror and carving seemed heavier now, their contents a connection to a past he'd nearly lost. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock, relief briefly visible on her face before her usual composure returned. You're late, she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. Had more to do in town than expected. Jackson stomped snow from his boots and entered the cabin's warmth. How is he? Sleeping now. His fever rose this afternoon but broke an hour ago. Your mother is with him. Jackson nodded, setting the recovered items on the table. I found these in the ruins. Thought they might bring some comfort. Eleanor's eyes softened as she unwrapped the bird carving and cracked mirror. Your mother will be grateful. She's mentioned both these items. She moved to the fire, stirring something that smelled delicious in the hanging pot. Are you hungry? Starving, Jackson admitted, suddenly aware he hadn't eaten since morning. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming him from the inside. Afterward, Eleanor brought fresh bandages for his raw hands. You've been digging again, she observed, cleaning dirt from his abrasions. The strongbox was buried under half the cabin. Eleanor worked methodically, her touch gentle despite her brisk manner. And your visit to town? Did you find your banker? Gone to Cheyenne, supposedly. Jackson winced as she applied a stinging salve. Sheriff Taylor is sending wires to have him detained. Good. Eleanor wrapped clean cloth around his palm. What will you do when they find him? See that he faces justice. Legal justice, he clarified, remembering their conversation from the previous night. The law will deal with him. Eleanor nodded approvingly. And the bank? I'm reversing all foreclosures, including yours. Jackson met her gaze. Your land is secure. The deed will be sent over with clear title. She stiffened. I told you I don't want... It's not charity, he interrupted. It's justice. Hargrove targeted you specifically because of this land's location. What I'm doing is correcting a wrong committed in my name with my resources. Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. I suppose I can accept that distinction. There's more, Jackson continued. Mrs. Chen will be sending deliveries. Regular supplies, food, medicine. And who's paying for these deliveries? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. The town, Jackson said smoothly. Apparently, once certain facts came to light about your care for various citizens over the years, including Mrs. Chen's husband, the town council decided it was time to repay some debts. The town council? Eleanor's voice was flat with disbelief. The same counsel that was ready to run me out of town for impropriety 2 days ago? People can change their minds when presented with new information. Jackson held her gaze steadily. Will you accept the supplies or not? After a long moment, Eleanor nodded. For your parents' sake, and because your father needs proper nourishment to recover. Jackson smiled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later, as Eleanor checked on William, Jackson examined the strongbox. It was locked, the key likely lost in the fire. After a moment's consideration, he took it outside to the woodshed where his tools were stored. A few minutes' work with a chisel popped the lock. Inside, he found exactly what his father had described. Land deeds, including the original homestead grant signed by President Lincoln himself. Letters, many in faded ink and fragile with age. The leather-bound family Bible, its pages yellowed but intact. At the bottom lay a small velvet pouch. Curious, Jackson opened it. Inside was a gold pocket watch in a daguerreotype of a young woman in Confederate address. Beautiful, proud, with eyes that seemed to challenge the viewer. He turned it over. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written, Margaret Morgan Caldwell, Richmond, 1860. The name jolted him. Margaret Caldwell, his father's sister, the one never spoken of, who had married a southern plantation owner before the war. The family connection that had been severed when Virginia seceded. This, then, was why the strongbox was so important to William. Not just for the deeds and legal papers, but for this connection to a past he'd never publicly mourned. A sister lost not just to death, but to the divisions of war. The watch must have been hers or her husband's, a family heirloom William had kept despite everything, a reminder of what the war had cost them all. Jackson carefully returned everything to the box, securing it as best he could with the damaged lock, and brought it back inside. Eleanor was sitting by the fire, knitting what appeared to be a new bandage from clean white cloth. Found something interesting? She asked, not looking up from her work. Family history, Jackson replied, setting the box on the table, including a relative I never knew my father cared about. His sister, Eleanor said quietly, Margaret. He spoke of her during his fever dreams. Jackson looked at her sharply. You knew? Only what he mumbled in delirium, that she died at Richmond when the city fell, that he never got to say goodbye. Eleanor's needles clicked rhythmically. The past has a way of surfacing when we're at our weakest. Jackson sat heavily in the chair opposite her. He never told me any of it. I knew he had Southern sympathies, but I never understood why. Family ties run deeper than political allegiances, Eleanor observed, even in war, perhaps especially then. Is that why your mother stayed with the Confederate wounded, even as a Union nurse? Humanity, Eleanor corrected. She stayed because suffering doesn't wear a uniform. They fell silent, the fire crackling between them, each lost in thoughts of a war long over but never truly ended for those who had lived through it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in clean white, covering the scars of the war with the promise of something new. The following morning, William was stronger, his eyes clearer than they had been since his collapse. The storm had passed in the night, leaving a crystalline blue sky and sunshine that streamed through the cabin windows. Jackson had risen early to clear snow from the paths and check on the livestock, returning to find his father sitting up, the strongbox open on his lap. I see you've been examining our family history, William said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. I have, Pa, Jackson replied, settling into the chair beside the bed. There's a lot I never knew. William's eyes widened slightly, then he nodded. You opened it. Had to break the lock. Sorry. No matter. William's gnarled hand rested on the box. Time you knew anyway. He looked at Rebecca. Help me sit up more. Eleanor moved forward. Mr. Morgan, you shouldn't exert— Hush, woman, William said, but without heat. Some things are worth exertion. With Rebecca's help, he managed to sit more upright. He opened the box with trembling hands and withdrew the velvet pouch. From it, he took the daguerreotype, holding it so both Eleanor and Jackson could see. My sister, he said simply, brilliant girl, headstrong, married a Virginia tobacco planter named James Caldwell in '59, had a son in '60. His voice grew rough. When the war came, her husband joined the Confederate cavalry, died at Cold Harbor. Margaret stayed in Richmond, turned their home into a hospital for wounded soldiers. He looked directly at Eleanor. That's where your mother trained as a nurse under Margaret's guidance. Eleanor stared at the image, recognition gradually dawning on her face. Mrs. Caldwell, she whispered. My mother spoke of her often. She called her the lady surgeon, said she performed operations no woman was supposed to know how to do. That was Margaret, William said, a hint of pride breaking through the sadness. Always defying expectations. Our father was a doctor in Pennsylvania. He taught her medicine from the time she could read, though he knew she could never practice officially. He traced the edge of the daguerreotype with his thumb. She had a gift for it, a natural healer. She saved many lives, Eleanor said softly, Confederate and Union alike. My mother said she treated soldiers based on medical need, not uniform color. William nodded. She stayed in Richmond until the very end, refused to evacuate. The fire that swept the city after the Confederate withdrawal took her and many of her patients. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I learned months later, after the surrender. Never got to tell her I was sorry for the words we exchanged when she chose the South, for the letters I returned unopened. His gaze shifted to Jackson. Margaret chose the South, you chose the North. And he paused, struggling for breath. I chose pride over family. Twice. Jackson looked up sharply. What do you mean? When you enlisted, William said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the women in the other room. I told myself it was about principles, about states' rights, about the government overreaching. He shook his head slowly, but it wasn't. It was fear. Fear of losing another child to that damned war. You never said. How could I? William's eyes, so like Jackson's own, finally met his son's directly. How could I tell my Union-proud son that I'd already buried a nephew in Confederate gray, that I'd lost a sister to Richmond's fall, that every time I looked at your blue uniform, I saw their ghosts? Understanding dawned on Jackson. So instead you shut me out. Easier to be angry than afraid, William admitted. When the telegram came about Elizabeth, his voice faltered. I thought God was punishing me again. Taking your child like Catherine's had been taken because I'd turned my back on family. Why didn't you tell me this when I came home? Jackson asked. Pride, William said simply. Cursed Morgan pride. By then the wall was too high, and you were building your own walls, your empire of land and cattle. A rough laugh escaped him. Guess we're more alike than either of us wanted to admit. Rebecca placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. William covered it with his own. That's what I wanted you to know, son. Why I needed this box found. His hand gripped Jackson's with surprising strength. Don't make my mistake. Don't let pride keep you from family, from forgiveness. The moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Then William released his grip and settled back against the pillows, exhausted by the effort and emotion. Enough for tonight, Eleanor said firmly, taking the photograph and returning it to the pouch. You need rest, Mr. Morgan. For once, William didn't argue. His eyes were already closing, the brief surge of energy fading. Keep the box safe, Jackson, he murmured. It's your history now. As Jackson and Eleanor left the sick room, closing the door quietly behind them, a new understanding hung in the air between them. The past that had shaped them both, the war that had divided and connected them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Will he recover? Jackson asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. I believe so. He has a strong heart despite everything, and now that he's shared this burden. She glanced back toward the closed door. Secrets can weigh heavier than any physical ailment. Letting them go is sometimes the best medicine. Is that why you told me about your mother's Confederate service? To let go of the secret? Perhaps. Eleanor moved to bank the fire for the night. Or perhaps to help you understand that the lines we draw in war between North and South, right and wrong, friend and enemy, are rarely as clear as we believe. She looked at him directly, the firelight casting her face in soft gold. Your father and my mother should have been enemies. Instead, she saved his life. And 20 years later, he saved mine through his testimony to the town council. Margaret and my mother should have been enemies, yet they worked side by side to preserve life amid destruction. And you and I? Jackson asked quietly. That, Eleanor said, her voice equally soft, remains to be written, Mr. Morgan. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the past with the promise of something new. The next 2 weeks brought steady change to the small cabin on Ridge Creek. Under Jackson's direction, the addition took shape rapidly, a proper bedroom for William with large windows to let in the winter sunlight, a small sitting area, an expanded storage space that transformed the cramped dwelling into a comfortable home. Mrs. Chen's son, Wei, arrived faithfully every third day with deliveries. Each time, Eleanor received the supplies with a mixture of reluctance and gratitude, her proud nature still struggling with accepting help. Jackson noticed, however, that her protest grew less vehement as William's condition improved and the cabin's transformation progressed. The days lengthened perceptibly now as February gave way to March, sunlight stretching longer across the wooden floors of the cabin each evening. By mid-March, the worst of winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the Wyoming highlands. Patches of ground emerged from melting snow, and the creek's ice thinned at the edges. Inside the cabin, William sat up in his new bed for the first time without assistance, color returning to his face along with his customary stubbornness. "I'm not an invalid anymore," he insisted when Eleanor tried to prevent him from standing. "Been lying in this bed long enough to grow roots." "Another week of rest won't kill you," Eleanor replied, unimpressed by his bluster. "But getting up too soon might." "The woman's right, William," Rebecca added from her chair by the window. "Dr. Wilkins was quite clear about your recovery time." William scowled at them both. "Two women fossing worse than mother hens. Where's Jackson? At least he'll talk sense." "He's finishing the roof on the new storage shed," Eleanor said, "and he'd agree with us if he were here." William harumphed but settled back against his pillows. "At least bring me something useful to do. Can't lie here staring at the ceiling all day." Eleanor considered him for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose some light woodworking wouldn't strain your heart too badly if you stay in bed." She retrieved William's carving tools and a few pieces of pine from the main room. His face brightened at the sight of them, hands reaching eagerly despite their weakness. "What shall it be this time?" Rebecca asked, smiling at her husband's childlike enthusiasm. "Another horse?" "No," William said thoughtfully, turning a piece of wood in his hands. "Something different. Something for the future." As he began to carve, Eleanor slipped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the crisp air. She found Jackson atop the new shed, hammering the final shingles into place. For a moment, she simply watched him work. The confident swing of the hammer, the sureness of his movements so different from the uncertain businessmen who had arrived at her door nearly a month ago. The physical labor had transformed him. His face was tanned from outdoor work, his shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been before, his hands now calloused from honest work rather than soft from signing papers. "Your father's awake," she called up to him, and demanding freedom from his medical oppressors. Jackson looked down and grinned. "Sounds like he's feeling better. Well enough to complain, which is a good sign." Eleanor shielded her eyes against the sun. "I've given him his carving tools to keep him occupied." "That was kind of you." "It was practical," Eleanor corrected, though a faint smile betrayed her. "A bored William Morgan is a difficult patient." "True enough." Jackson hammered in one last nail, then made his way down the ladder. Up close, she could see the changes in him more clearly, his face leaner, his eyes clearer, the weight of perpetual worry lifted from his shoulders. "I was thinking of riding into town tomorrow," he said, setting his hammer in the toolbox. "The sheriff sent word that Hargrove has been detained in Cheyenne. They need my formal statement." Eleanor nodded, her expression sobering. "Will you be gone long?" "A day, perhaps 2. He studied her face. "Will you be all right here with my father still recovering?" "We managed before you came, Mr. Morgan," she reminded him. "We'll manage while you're gone." "Jackson," he said quietly. "What?" "My name is Jackson. After all this time, I think you could use it." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. "Very well, Jackson." His name felt strange on her tongue, an intimacy she wasn't sure she was ready for. "We'll be fine while you're in town. I know you will hurry back." All the same. When Jackson arrived, the small gallery was already filled with curious townspeople. News of Hargrove's arrest and the accusations against him had spread quickly, fueled by the dramatic story of the Morgan homestead fire and William's near death. Hargrove sat at a table near the front, flanked by 2 territorial marshals. His once immaculate appearance had deteriorated, his suit wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When he spotted Jackson, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and resentment. The territorial judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister, called the hearing to order. "This is a preliminary examination into the charges against Vincent Hargrove," he announced. "The purpose is to determine if sufficient evidence exists to hold the accused for trial on charges of arson, attempted murder, and fraudulent business practices." The proceedings moved efficiently. Sheriff Taylor presented the physical evidence found at the Morgan homestead, traces of coal oil on the remaining timbers, clear signs that the fire had been deliberately set. Then came witnesses. The station master who'd seen Hargrove arguing with William Morgan 3 days before the fire, the bank clerk who testified about Hargrove's aggressive foreclosure policies, and finally Jackson himself. He spoke clearly, detailing Hargrove's scheme to acquire land for the railroad and the threats made against property owners who refused to sell. When he described finding his parents' home in ashes, believing them possibly dead, a murmur ran through the crowd. "And you believe, Mr. Morgan," Judge Hollister asked, "that the defendant set this fire with the intent to either force your parents from their land or cause them harm?" "I do, Your Honor." Jackson's voice was strained. "The evidence points clearly to Mr. Hargrove's involvement, either directly or through hired men." The judge turned to Hargrove. "Does the accused wish to make a statement at this time?" Hargrove rose, straightening his rumpled jacket in a pathetic attempt at dignity. "Your Honor, these accusations are absurd. I have served the Morgan banking interests faithfully for years. Everything I did was for the greater prosperity of this region." He pointed a shaking finger at Jackson. "He approved all my actions. The railroad deal would have made us both wealthy beyond imagination." "I never approved threatening or harming innocent people," Jackson replied coldly. "Business requires difficult decisions." Hargrove's voice rose hysterically. "Progress demands sacrifice. Those backward homesteaders were standing in the way of civilization." Judge Hollister banged his gavel. "Control yourself, Mr. Hargrove." But Hargrove was beyond control, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "You self-righteous hypocrite!" he shouted at Jackson. "You were happy enough to profit from my methods until they touched your precious family. How many other families lost their homes while you counted your money in that mansion of yours?" The accusation struck home. Jackson had indeed been willfully blind to the source of his bank's profits, content to leave the details to Hargrove while he expanded his cattle empire. His complicity through negligence was a burden he would carry. Before Jackson could respond, Hargrove lunged forward, evading the marshal's grasp and crossing the short distance to where Jackson stood. "You're no better than me, Morgan," he hissed, close enough that Jackson could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "We're cut from the same cloth, men who take what we want." "That's enough." Sheriff Taylor moved to restrain Hargrove, but Jackson raised a hand to stop him. "No, let him speak," Jackson said, his voice steady as he faced Hargrove directly. "Everyone should hear this." The courtroom fell silent, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation. "You're wrong, Vincent," Jackson said quietly. "We're not the same. I was blind, yes. Negligent, yes, but I never set fire to a man's home. I never tried to burn an elderly couple alive in their beds." Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "They weren't supposed to be there." The words escaped before he could stop them, a damning admission that drew gasps from the crowd. "What did you say?" Judge Hollister demanded, leaning forward on the bench. Realizing his mistake, Hargrove paled visibly. I didn't mean—" "They weren't supposed to be there," Jackson repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You knew their routine. Knew they usually spent Wednesday nights in town with friends, but that night there was a storm, so they stayed home. Isn't that right, Vincent?" Sweat beaded on Hargrove's forehead. "You can't prove anything." "Your hired man confessed," Sheriff Taylor interjected, stepping forward with a folded paper. "Signed statement says you paid him $50 to burn that old shack when nobody was home, so the Morgan land would be cleared for the railroad." Hargrove's shoulders slumped, the last of his defiance evaporating. "It was just business," he whispered. "Just business." "No," Jackson said, turning to face the courtroom full of people who had once respected him for his wealth alone. "It was greed. My greed, too, for letting it happen under my name. He looked back at Hargrove. The difference between us, Vincent, is that I'm willing to make it right. Judge Hollister studied them both, then nodded decisively. I've heard enough. Vincent Hargrove will be held over for trial on all charges. Trial date to be set within 60 days. As the marshals led Hargrove away, he turned for one last venomous glare at Jackson. You think this makes you a good man? He spat. Playing the hero, building a little love nest with that backwoods widow? Jackson stiffened at the mention of Eleanor. Hargrove saw the reaction and smiled cruelly. Oh yes, I know all about your arrangement. My contacts say you're quite comfortable together. Tell me, does she know how many families you've displaced for your cattle empire? How many widows like her have lost everything because of Morgan Bank foreclosures? Jackson moved forward, but Sheriff Taylor blocked his path. He's not worth it, son, the older man cautioned. He's just trying to provoke you. You're right, Jackson agreed after a tense moment, forcing himself to relax. But he's also right about one thing. I have much to answer for. He raised his voice so everyone in the courtroom could hear, which is why, effective immediately, Morgan Valley Bank will suspend all foreclosure proceedings. Anyone who lost their property through my bank's actions in the past 3 years can apply for review and potential reinstatement of ownership. Murmurs of shock rippled through the gallery. Hargrove's face contorted with disgust. Fool! You'll ruin everything we built. No, Jackson replied as the marshals resumed leading Hargrove away. I'm going to build something better, something that won't burn down in the night. After the hearing, Sheriff Taylor approached Jackson. That took courage, he said, admitting your part in it. Jackson shook his head. Not courage, honesty. There's a difference. Still, Taylor clapped him on the shoulder. Most men in your position would have laid all the blame on Hargrove. I'm trying not to be most men anymore, Jackson replied. He looked around the emptying courtroom at the townspeople watching him with new eyes, some respectful, others still wary. I have a lot to make right in this town. After the hearing, Jackson visited the telegraph office to send wires to his ranch foreman and to business associates in Denver, reorganizing his affairs to allow his extended stay at Ridge Creek. Then he stopped at Mrs. Chen's store to arrange additional deliveries and purchase special items he thought might brighten the cabin. A colorful quilt, a set of leather-bound books, seeds for spring planting. Mrs. Chen watched him select these items with knowing eyes. Mrs. Reed will say these are too much, she observed. Too expensive. Probably, Jackson agreed, adding a package of expensive tea to his purchases. But sometimes people need to accept gifts even when pride says otherwise. Wise words. Mrs. Chen wrapped his selections carefully. You are changing, Mr. Morgan, like river changing course after winter ice breaks. Jackson smiled slightly. Let's hope it's a change for the better. Better already, she assured him, but river must be patient. Some banks take longer to shape. He understood her meaning. Eleanor's walls had been built over years of self-reliance and hardship. They wouldn't come down overnight, no matter how earnestly he tried to breach them. As he prepared to leave town, Jackson made one final stop at the small church. He found Pastor Morrison in his study, surrounded by books and papers. Mr. Morgan, the pastor rose, clearly surprised by the visit. What brings you to our humble church? A matter of conscience, Pastor. Jackson remained standing, declining the offered chair. I wanted to discuss Eleanor Reed. Morrison's expression grew guarded. Mrs. Reed is a complicated subject. She shouldn't be, Jackson said firmly. She's a good woman who's been treated poorly by this town, by this church. Now see here. No, you see here. Jackson's tone was respectful but unyielding. That woman saved my parents' lives. She's cared for the sick in this community without compensation or recognition. Yet when she needed help after her husband died, this town turned its back. When she took in my parents, this church questioned her morality. The pastor had the grace to look uncomfortable. Perhaps there were misunderstandings. Then it's time to correct them. Jackson placed an envelope on the desk. This is a donation for the church, a substantial one. I'd like it used to establish a fund for widows and others in need, and I'd like Eleanor Reed to help administer it. Morrison stared at the envelope, then at Jackson. That's highly irregular. So is a church that preaches charity but practices judgment, Jackson interrupted. Consider this an opportunity for reconciliation, Pastor, for the church and for the town. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. When my father is well enough to travel, I'd like you to come to Ridge Creek to offer communion. Yes, of course, but more importantly, to offer a genuine apology to Mrs. Reed. Can I count on you for that? Faced with both the sizable donation and Jackson's direct challenge, Pastor Morrison could only nod his agreement. Jackson returned to the cabin the following afternoon, his saddlebags laden with the gifts he'd purchased and news of Hargrove's detention. He found the household in an unexpected state of activity. William, against all medical advice, was seated in a chair by the fire, directing Rebecca and Eleanor as they rearranged furniture in the newly completed addition. The table should face the window, William insisted. A man likes to see the sky while he eats. The morning sun will be in our eyes, Rebecca countered. The table belongs along the wall. Eleanor noticed Jackson in the doorway and gave him a look that clearly said, "See what I've been dealing with?" "You're supposed to be in bed," Jackson said to his father, dismounting and securing Emperor. William waved dismissively. "Been in that bed so long I was starting to take root. Besides, a man needs to oversee his home's arrangement." "His home?" Jackson raised an eyebrow at Eleanor. "Apparently we're all just living in William Morgan's domain now," she replied dryly, "despite whose name is on the deed." Despite her sarcastic tone, Jackson detected a note of affection in her voice. In the short time they'd been together, a bond had formed between Eleanor and his parents, particularly William. Their shared experiences of war, loss, and survival had created a connection that transcended their different backgrounds. "How was town?" Eleanor asked as she helped him unload his saddlebags. "Productive," Jackson summarized the hearing and Hargrove's outburst. "He'll stand trial within 2 months." "Good," Rebecca said. "About time," William called from his chair. "Always said that man had a dishonest look about him." Rebecca smiled indulgently at her husband. "You say that about every banker, dear. And I'm usually right." Eleanor led Jackson to the kitchen area away from his parents' bickering. "And the other matters? Your ranch, your business affairs?" "All arranged." Jackson unpacked the supplies he'd brought. "My foreman will manage the ranch operations. The bank has a new acting manager with strict oversight from a board I trust." Eleanor watched him, her gray eyes searching. "How long do you intend to stay here, Jackson?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond its simple phrasing. "As long as I'm needed," he answered carefully. "My father still has a long recovery ahead, and there's the matter of rebuilding their home." "They could go to your ranch," Eleanor pointed out. "You have space, servants, comfort." "They could," Jackson agreed, "but they won't. This is where they want to be." "With me?" Skepticism colored her voice. "Or with you?" "Both, I think." Jackson met her gaze directly. "And I want to be here too, Eleanor. Not just for them." A flush of color touched her cheeks, and she turned away, busying herself with organizing the supplies. "You've brought half of Mrs. Chen's store," she observed, changing the subject. They're gifts," Jackson said simply, "for the home you've shared with us." "I don't need—" "Gifts aren't about need," he interrupted gently. "They're about appreciation, about connection." Eleanor's hand stilled on the colorful quilt he'd brought. Her fingers traced the intricate pattern, lingering on the rich fabric. "It's beautiful," she admitted softly. "Like this place," Jackson said, "like the life you've built here against all odds." Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a momentary lowering of the walls she'd built so carefully around herself. Then she folded the quilt and set it aside. "Your father should return to bed before he exhausts himself," she said, professional efficiency replacing vulnerability. "And you must be tired from your journey." Jackson accepted the return to practicalities, understanding that Eleanor needed time. The river Mrs. Chen had spoken of was still finding its course, wearing down resistance gradually rather than all at once. April arrived with the first real signs of spring. The snow retreated to shadowed hollows and north-facing slopes, leaving the rest of the land muddy, but increasingly green. William's strength returned steadily, allowing him short walks outside on fair days. Jackson continued his improvements to the cabin and surrounding property, building a proper barn to replace the lean-to and preparing a large garden plot for Eleanor. On a particularly mild morning, Jackson found Eleanor at the edge of the newly turned garden, studying the soil with a critical eye. Will it do? He asked, joining her. The soil's good, she acknowledged. Better drainage than my old plot behind the cabin. We should get a fine yield if the weather holds. We, Jackson noted, pleased by her use of the word. Eleanor glanced at him, then back at the garden. Well, I assume you'll be here for the planting at least. Whether you stay for the harvest remains to be seen. I told you I'm not leaving. Men say many things, Jackson. Her voice held no accusation, just a simple statement of her experience. Time will tell which promises hold. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Coming up the trail were two riders, Pastor Morrison and another man Jackson didn't recognize. Were you expecting visitors? Eleanor asked, tension evident in her posture. Just the pastor, Jackson replied. I asked him to come when my father was stronger. What for? It's all right, Eleanor. This is a peace offering, not a confrontation. She didn't appear convinced but accompanied him to meet the arrivals. Pastor Morrison dismounted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable on horseback. His companion, a younger man with kind eyes and a medical bag, dismounted with more grace. Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Reed, the pastor greeted them. May I present Dr. Matthew Lawrence? He's newly arrived in Cedar Valley to establish a practice. Doctor, Jackson shook the man's hand, we're grateful for your visit. My father has been improving, but another medical opinion would be welcome. Happy to help, Dr. Lawrence replied, his voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. Pastor Morrison mentioned the heart condition. I've had some success with similar cases in Boston. Eleanor regarded the newcomer with professional interest. You're a long way from Boston, doctor. I wanted to practice where I was truly needed, Lawrence explained. Frontier communities often lack proper medical care. A noble sentiment, Eleanor said, though her tone suggested skepticism about how long such nobility might last in the harsh realities of Wyoming. They led the visitors inside, where William greeted the pastor with gruff courtesy and submitted to Dr. Lawrence's examination with surprising cooperation. While the doctor worked, Pastor Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Reed, he began, I've come to offer the churches, that is, my personal. He faltered, then started again more directly. I've come to apologize for our treatment of you, both after Mr. Reed's passing and more recently regarding the Morgan stay here. Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. Have you now? Yes. Morrison twisted his hat in his hands. Our Lord teaches compassion and charity, yet I failed to demonstrate either. Instead of supporting a widow in need, I allowed town gossip and propriety to dictate my actions. It was unchristian of me. It was human of you, Pastor, Eleanor replied, her voice softer than Jackson expected. We all fall short of our highest principles at times. Nevertheless, I ask your forgiveness. And I bring news, Morrison continued, looking relieved. The church has established a fund for those in need, widows, orphans, the ill. We would be honored if you would help administer it, given your experience with the community's medical needs. Eleanor glanced at Jackson, understanding immediately his role in this development. That's a generous offer, Pastor. I'll consider it. From the bedroom, Dr. Lawrence emerged, looking pleased. Mr. Morgan's recovery is remarkable, he announced. The heart is stronger than I expected, though he'll need continued rest and careful monitoring. Thanks to Eleanor's care, Rebecca said proudly, she's been extraordinary. Indeed, Lawrence turned to Eleanor with professional respect. Your nursing skills are evident, Mrs. Reed. The surgical scar on his side, that's from a battlefield procedure, isn't it? Gettysburg, Eleanor confirmed, though it was my mother's work, not mine. She served as a nurse there. The stitching is expert, Lawrence continued. She must have trained you well. She believed women should understand medicine, even if society wouldn't allow them to practice it officially. Lawrence's expression brightened with interest. A progressive thinker. I share that philosophy. In fact, I've been hoping to find a qualified assistant for my new practice, someone with experience treating frontier ailments as well as standard medical conditions. Eleanor stared at him, clearly caught off guard. Are you offering me a position, doctor? I am, Lawrence spoke earnestly. Cedar Valley needs more medical care than one doctor can provide. Your knowledge of local remedies, combined with my formal training, could serve the community well. The proposition hung in the air, unexpected and transformative. Jackson watched Eleanor's face, seeing the professional recognition she'd long been denied suddenly within reach. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I have responsibilities here. The garden to plant, Mr. Morgan's continued recovery." "We would manage," Rebecca interrupted gently. "Your skills are too valuable to be limited to one family." "Think about it," Lawrence suggested. "The position would be part-time initially, perhaps 2 days a week in town with emergency calls as needed." After the visitors departed, promising to return the following week, an unusual quiet settled over the cabin. William had retired to rest after the examination, and Rebecca busied herself with mending, leaving Eleanor and Jackson alone by the fire. "You're considering it," Jackson observed, watching Eleanor's pensive expression. "It would be foolish not to," she admitted. "Proper medical work, official recognition of my skills." She shook her head slightly. "Things I never thought possible here." "You deserve it," Jackson said sincerely. "Your abilities have been overlooked too long." Eleanor studied him. "This was your doing, wasn't it, Maynard? The pastor's apology, the church fund, perhaps even the new doctor." "I may have encouraged the pastor's change of heart," Jackson acknowledged. "But Dr. Lawrence sought you out on his own merit. Your reputation as a healer is more widespread than you realize." "And what of your parents? Your promise to stay and help them rebuild." "That hasn't changed." Jackson leaned forward. "Eleanor, don't you see? This is an opportunity for both of us to build something meaningful here. My parents' new home, your medical practice, a community that values contribution over appearance. And us?" she asked quietly. "What would we be building, Jackson?" The question struck at the heart of what had remained unspoken between them. The growing connection, the possibility of something more than a temporary arrangement. "Whatever we choose," he answered honestly. "I can only tell you what I want, Eleanor. A life that matters. Work that serves others rather than just myself and someone to share it with who understands both the person I was and the man I'm trying to become." Eleanor looked into the fire, silent for a long moment. "I've been alone a long time," she said finally. "Built walls to protect myself after Thomas died. It's not easy to imagine life another way." "I know." Jackson resisted the urge to touch her hand. "I built different walls. Wealth, distance, constant movement. They protected me from feeling the loss of Elizabeth and our child. And now I'm learning that protection can become a prison." He smiled slightly. "A wise woman once told me that stillness isn't weakness. It's where healing starts." The ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Sounds like someone who talks too much. Sounds like someone who changed my life." The following Sunday, at William's insistence, they attended services at the Cedar Valley Church. It was the first time Eleanor had entered the building since Thomas's funeral, and her apprehension was palpable as they approached. "We don't have to do this," Jackson murmured, as he helped her down from the wagon. "Yes, we do," she replied firmly. "Some ghosts need facing in daylight." Their entrance caused a predictable stir. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, whispers rippled through the congregation. Then Mrs. Chen, sitting in the third row, stood and deliberately crossed to Eleanor, taking her hand warmly. "Mrs. Reed, so good to see you in church again." Her voice carried clearly in the hushed sanctuary. "Please join our family. We save places." One by one, other townspeople followed Mrs. Chen's example. The blacksmith's wife, who remembered how Eleanor had set her son's broken arm. The school teacher, whose pneumonia Eleanor had treated the previous winter. Even old Mrs. Hollister, the judge's mother, who credited Eleanor with saving her eyesight with a special herbal compress. By the time Pastor Morrison arrived to begin the service, Eleanor was seated among the congregation, surrounded by people whose lives she had touched. Her initial isolation transformed into belonging. During his sermon, the pastor spoke of redemption and community, of the need for forgiveness and second chances. Though he never mentioned Eleanor directly, his meaning was clear to everyone present. "Today marks a new beginning for our church," he concluded, "a return to the principles of compassion and service that should guide all Christian communities. Let us go forward together, supporting one another in times of need, celebrating together in times of joy." After the service, Dr. Lawrence approached Eleanor on the church steps, confirming arrangements for her to begin working at his clinic the following Wednesday. William, leaning on his walking stick, but prouder than Jackson had seen him in years, made a point of introducing Eleanor to everyone as the woman who saved my life twice. The next morning, Jackson found a moment alone with Dr. Lawrence before the physician departed. Doctor, about my father's heart condition, is it a result of the fire or something more? Lawrence considered the question carefully. Both, I would say. Your father has an old injury, shrapnel embedded near his heart from the war. Eleanor mentioned it was from Gettysburg. Yes, her mother apparently treated him there. Well, that wound never fully healed internally, Lawrence explained. Most men wouldn't have survived it at all, but your father is remarkably resilient. However, the smoke inhalation and stress from the fire put tremendous strain on his already compromised heart. The cold night in the barn afterward likely exacerbated the condition. Jackson's face darkened. So Hargrove's actions could have killed him, even if the fire hadn't. Quite possibly. Lawrence nodded gravely. The body remembers old wounds, Mr. Morgan. Sometimes they lie dormant for years until a new trauma awakens them. He packed his medical bag. Your father needs consistent care now. The damage can't be undone, but with proper treatment, he could have many good years ahead. As the doctor mounted his horse, he added, You're fortunate Mrs. Reed recognized the symptoms. Few would have connected his collapse to an old war wound. She has remarkable medical intuition. The information settled heavily on Jackson. His father's condition was more complicated than he'd realized, a combination of past sacrifice and present treachery. The war that had divided them continued to exact its price even decades later. The drive back to Ridge Creek was peaceful, the spring afternoon filled with birdsong and the scent of new growth. William and Rebecca dozed in the back of the wagon, tired from the excursion but visibly contented. It went better than you expected, Jackson observed, keeping his voice low to avoid waking his parents. It did, Eleanor admitted, though I'm still not entirely convinced it will last. People can change, Eleanor. Communities, too. Perhaps, she looked out at the greening landscape, or perhaps they simply needed permission to be their better selves. Is that what I needed? Jackson asked, thinking of his own transformation. Permission? Eleanor considered this. No, you needed stillness, the chance to stop running long enough to remember who you truly are. In the simple truth of her words touched him deeply. They drove in comfortable silence until they reached the final ridge overlooking the cabin. Jackson halted the wagon, taking in the scene below. The expanded cabin with its new addition, the garden plot ready for planting, the small barn he'd built. What had been a lonely widow's struggle for survival had become something else entirely. Something with a future. I've been thinking, he said quietly, about my parents' homestead. They'll need a new house, Eleanor agreed, once William is fully recovered. Yes, but I'm not sure the older location is right anymore. The memories there are complicated now, after the fire, after everything that's happened. Eleanor studied him. What are you suggesting? Jackson gestured toward the open land extending from Eleanor's property. That field to the west of your cabin, it's part of your 100 acres, isn't it? It is. It would make a fine building site, close enough for family to support each other, but with enough distance for privacy. My land, he hesitated, then added, if you'd consider it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, gazing at the land in question. I've never thought of sharing my land before, she said finally. It's been my one security in an uncertain world. I understand, Jackson nodded, careful not to press. It was just a thought. A good one, she surprised him by saying. Your parents would be close enough for me to monitor William's health, and the land is fertile but unplanted. A shame to waste it. Hope rose in Jackson's chest. Then you'll consider it? I'll more than consider it, Eleanor's eyes met his. I think it's the right solution for all of us. The all of us lingered between them, its meaning expanding beyond his parents to include something still forming, still finding its shape. As April unfolded, the landscape transformed weekly, first with the emergence of green shoots through melting snow, then with the first hardy wildflowers dotting the southern slopes. The following Wednesday, Jackson drove Eleanor to town for her first day at Dr. Lawrence's clinic. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Rebecca had helped modify for professional appearance, and carried a small medical bag containing herbs and remedies the doctor had asked her to bring. Nervous? Jackson asked as they approached the town. No, Eleanor replied automatically, then smiled slightly. Yes, it's been a long time since I practiced proper medicine, not just frontier remedies and common sense. You'll be magnificent, Jackson assured him. Your knowledge runs deeper than you give yourself credit for. The clinic was a modest building near the town square, freshly painted with Dr. Matthew Lawrence, physician and surgeon, on a new sign above the door. Inside, the doctor had created a surprisingly well-equipped facility with a waiting room, examination area, and small surgical theater. Mrs. Reed, Lawrence greeted them warmly. Right on time. We already have 3 patients waiting, including Mrs. Hollister for her eye examination. Eleanor's professional demeanor took over immediately. She bid Jackson a brief goodbye, arranged to meet him at midday, and turned her full attention to the work at hand. Jackson spent the morning at the bank, continuing the reforms he'd begun after Hargrove's arrest. He met with farmers who'd faced foreclosure, arranging more favorable terms and, in some cases, outright forgiveness of impossible debts. The work was satisfying in a way his previous business endeavors had never been, building community rather than just personal wealth. At noon, he stopped by the clinic to find it still busy with patients. Eleanor moved efficiently between rooms, her earlier nervousness replaced by confident expertise. She spotted him in the doorway and approached, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. We're running behind, she explained. Dr. Lawrence asked if I could stay through the afternoon. There's been a steady stream of patients since we opened, many women who've been putting off treatment because they were uncomfortable with a male physician. Of course, Jackson agreed readily. I'll meet you at the Hollisters for dinner as planned. Yes, though I may be a bit late. She hesitated, then surprised him by briefly squeezing his hand. Thank you, Jackson, for everything. The simple gesture and words carried more weight than 1,000 elaborate declarations might have. As Jackson watched her return to her patients, he felt a certainty settling in his chest, a vision of a future taking shape day by day, choice by choice. That evening, Judge Hollister's dinner table became the setting for an unexpected announcement. The Territorial Circuit Court was establishing a permanent presence in Cedar Valley, and the judge needed a legal advisor with knowledge of both banking regulations and land law. Your handling of this Hargrove situation showed good judgment, Morgan, Hollister said over dessert, and your banking experience would be invaluable as we establish proper legal framework for the territory's growth. I'm not a lawyer, Judge, Jackson pointed out. Don't need a full lawyer, Hollister replied. Need a man who understands the practical application of law and banking and land disputes. 3 days a week advising the court and reviewing cases. Rest of your time remains your own. Eleanor, seated beside Jackson, watched him carefully. It sounds like important work, she observed. It is, Hollister confirmed. As Wyoming moves towards statehood, we need men of integrity helping shape our legal system. Men who understand both progress and justice aren't always the same thing. Jackson considered the offer, aware of its symmetry with Eleanor's new position at the clinic. Both of them using their skills to serve the community, building something meaningful together. I'd be honored to accept, Judge, he said finally, though I should mention I'm planning to help rebuild my parents' home as well. On my land, Eleanor added quietly, drawing surprised looks from the others at the table, near Ridge Creek. Mrs. Hollister, a perceptive woman with a romantic streak, smiled broadly. How wonderful. The two of you working in town part-time, building a homestead together. Almost like a partnership. A practical arrangement, Eleanor supplied before the older woman could say something more presumptuous, benefiting all involved. Practical indeed, Mrs. Hollister agreed, though her knowing smile remained. Later, as Jackson drove Eleanor home beneath a canopy of stars, the conversation turned to their newly aligned futures. Judge Hollister seemed pleased with your acceptance, Eleanor observed, though his wife seemed to read more into our arrangement than currently exists. Jackson smiled at her diplomatic phrasing. Currently exists, he repeated. That suggests the possibility of change. All things change with time, Eleanor replied, though her tone had softened. Rivers find new courses, seasons turn. And people find each other, Jackson added quietly, sometimes when they least expect it. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness of the wagon seat. Sometimes, she agreed. As they crested the final hill overlooking Ridge Creek, they saw the cabin nestled below, lamplight glowing warm against the darkness. William and Rebecca had stayed up waiting for their return. 3 days later, under a clear spring sky, Jackson drove the first stake into the ground on the western field. Eleanor stood beside him, her medical bag at her feet. She had just returned from her second day working at Dr. Lawrence's clinic. "Here," she said, adjusting the position slightly. "This corner should catch the morning sun." Jackson nodded, driving the stake deeper. A good place to start the day. William approached slowly, leaning on his walking stick, Rebecca at his side. In his free hand, he carried a small wooden object. "I finished it," he said, holding it out to them. Eleanor took it, a miniature rocking chair, perfectly scaled to match the full-size ones on her porch. Its wood polish smooth, roses and vines intricately carved along the back. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Every home needs 3 chairs," William said, his eyes moving meaningfully between his son and Eleanor. "One for the past, one for the present, and one," he smiled, "for the future." Jackson met Eleanor's gaze, finding in her gray eyes no more walls, no more hesitation. Just possibility, stretching before them like the wide Wyoming sky. "For the future," he agreed, and reached for her hand again. This time, she didn't let go.